If what you said is true, Mark Withers and the NerdCage could be dangerous. Hello and welcome. That's right, you're trapped in NerdCage Live. This ain't just a reaction show, but a debate show and a live discussion on everything that makes people like you and I tick. So thank you for joining us tonight. Please hit that like button and subscribe. I'm your co-host, JSANG, coming to you live from Syracuse, New York, and always with me, the warrior from Wakanda, the fiend from Louisville, my man, Mark Withers. What's happening?
Hey, what's going on, man? Super excited to be here as usual. And yes, today's episode is going to focus on the 30th anniversary of a game changer. And of course, I'm talking about New Jack City, directed by Mario Van Peebles. Now, Jay, you and I both rewatched this over the weekend. What do you think? Does the movie still hold up for you?
You know what? It's got a few problems here and there, but you know what? At the end of the day, it's such a fun watch. I can't help myself. To me, this movie is not only entertaining, but in some twisted way, educational.
It's interesting that you say that too, as far as it being educational, because the genesis of the story actually comes out of an article that was written in the Village Voice by a guy named Barry Michael Cooper. He wrote an article called Kids Killing Kids, New Jack City Eats Its Young. And he used the term New Jack to describe this new version of gangster that was emerging out of the crack epidemic, right? Yeah. Now, that story got the attention of Quincy Jones, who then commissioned Cooper to write a screenplay on the life of a real life gangster in the 70s, Nicky Barnes. That first draft of the screenplay became the initial idea for what would eventually become New Jack City.
Oh man, yeah, this is why I was looking forward to hearing you spit them facts out, especially after watching this. And then of course, this was, in fact, Ice-T's very first movie.
That's right. So the story behind that, and Ice-T kind of talks about this a little bit in his book, but Ice-T was out at a club one night, and Mario Van Peebles, the director, happened to be at the same club. Ice-T was talking to somebody, and he said something to the effect of, if you could put me under a microscope and find the molecule in me that actually gives an F about whatever, and then whatever they were talking about. Well, that particular string of words impressed Mario Van Peebles so much that he said, whoever said that is going to be the star of my next movie. He wound up getting an introduction to Ice-T, and then he immediately invited him to take the part of Scotty.
Absolutely, without a doubt, none of this is his first movie, but his best movie. May not be his best performance, but it's definitely his best movie, in my opinion.
I like him in a number of different movies, and of course, I'm a big fan of him on Law & Order, where he plays Finn. But yeah, this to me is what kind of like gave him wings. It sort of gave him that career to sort of build a foundation on, and what a character to do that with.
Yeah, 100%. On top of that, we get one of the greatest antagonists ever, Wesley Snipes. Very well his best performance, or at least up there, top 3 performances from him. I absolutely love his character because we get to see Nino from the streets, and then over a course of time, and I like how it's executed and how it's explained, and how he just blows up and becomes this kingpin. You almost kind of root for him, right? Because I'm not saying what he's doing is right, not at all, but he had a hard life growing up. They established that. But the fact that he's like fighting for like the drug territory from the Italians and all that, and it's like fun to watch. So at the same time, you're rooting for Wesley Snipes and his empire, and you're also rooting for Ice-T and Mario Van Peebles to bust them. Like, you're rooting for both sides, and that's what's really intriguing about this movie.
Yeah, it's really compelling the way that they wrote those characters and sort of fleshed them out. Now, the interesting part about the Nino Brown character, particularly with Wesley Snipes, is that normally when a screenplay is written, you have a character that is written and developed, and then you try to find the actor that's best suited to play that character. Well, in the case of New Jack City, the character of Nino Brown was directly influenced by Wesley Snipes. So a few years prior, Wesley Snipes did a video with Michael Jackson for his song Bad.
Yes,
and
Bad.
He played a character in that. And that was very impressive to Barry Michael Cooper, one of the screenwriters. And so he based the Nino Brown character off that performance, and then sought Wesley Snipes out to play him.
Wow. wow. Yeah, I just think Wesley Snipes is absolute badass in this movie, and my brother's keeper, that's forever ingrained in pop culture. My brother's keeper, and that rooftop scene where he kills his best friend. Like, I'm sorry we're going to spoiler territory, but my God, that is a great, between that performance there on the rooftop and the courtroom scene. I know you're not too big on the courtroom scene. I love the courtroom scene.
Right.
The way Wesley Snipes just mouths off to the court system, says, I'm not the one that's guilty. Your society's guilty, and so on and so on. I just, oh my God. Oh, it's just so good. I feel like it's mandatory. It's a mandatory watch. If you're into the crime films, you're into these gangster films, this is a mandatory watch.
Right. And as I mentioned in the intro, this really was a game changer. I mean, nowadays we have tons of films that are similar to New Jack City, but this was really the film that sort of kicked all of that off. It gave you a sense of like, okay, this is what the modern gangster looks like. Before you had, The Godfather and Scarface and sort of these gangster films that are sort of cautionary tales, but they're all told from sort of an old world perspective. Whereas this told a very modern tale that took place in New York City, in the inner city.
In the streets.
Right, in the streets. And it directly addressed the crack epidemic, which was huge at the time.
Yeah, so speaking of crack, Chris Rock. Chris Rock's, this was his first, not his first film per se, but his first like big role. And he, he plays a crackhead. Oh my gosh. It's just fascinating seeing a young Chris Rock and Ice-T on screen together. And okay, I'm just going to say, right, like that was like the most believable crackhead performance I've ever seen. Yeah.
It was amazing. And, a fun fact about that one is that, once again, Chris Rock was not the first pick to play that role. That was originally supposed to go to Martin Lawrence. So there were a number of auditions. They when they were developing the film, a number of stand-up comedians went out for this part. They loved Martin Lawrence's performance so much that they pretty much locked him in immediately. But just before the film started to go into production, another comedian, Robin Harris, who he had been really close with, had just passed away. And he took the news of his death so hard that he felt that he really couldn't perform in this movie. So he gave the role up. And second in line for the part was Chris Rock. And that's how he ended up playing that part.
Yeah, and wow. And I will say this too, is like, again, this movie's 30 years old, so I don't feel bad for spoiling it for anybody. But the moment Chris Rock's character passes away, like, I feel like the intensity just takes off. Because because first it was Chris Rock that infiltrates Wesley Snipes' operation.
CMB, right.
Yeah, and then Ice-T goes in. It's really cool to see Chris Rock in that crazy performance, but once this character is outed, the movie gets even more intense. And then again, the ending in the courtrooms is just, it's insane. I love it. So funny how I came across this movie, and I want to hear how you came across this movie when you saw it. But like when I first saw the movie, it was because of Blade. Okay, when I saw Blade when it first came out, I fell in love with it. And then I remember at the video store, they have like all the Wesley Snipes movies together. And here's New Jack City sitting next to Blade. And I'm like, oh, I want to see this movie. So that's how I came across it. Blade was like my gateway drug to this movie. And then I just fell in love with this movie, ever since.
Yeah, as for me, I mean, I was working at a record store at the time. This would have been 1991. The soundtrack actually came out before the movie. And a bunch of us were listening to the soundtrack all the time. We were playing it in the store. We loved different hits from it, especially, Color Me Bad, Guy was on it, Troop was on it. There was a lot of good music on it. And then that only elevated our interest in going to see the movie when it came out. And it was such a phenomenon at the time that, was selling out places. And certain theaters in particular. I know that historically there was a big theater in LA. When people couldn't get in to see the movie, it led to like small riots around that theater. That's how popular it was. Yeah.
I gotta giggle because just because the content of the movie's causing riots.
Right. And it was blamed. Yeah, the actual content of the film was blamed for the behavior of the people who wanted to go see it. But it's nutty. And if you break it down and think about how big Ice-T was at the moment, And this would have
And
been
that was right before Body Count took off too.
Exactly. You know what I mean? And so he was riding this wave of being this huge gangster rapper. There's talk of this new band, Body Count, that he was working on. And then you get him in his very first movie, you know, and it's about, you know, inner city life and inner city gangs and things like that. And, you know, it piqued a lot of people's interest, so much in fact that it was an instant hit. I think the budget on this movie was $8 million and it grossed 47.6. So 3 times its own budget.
And it's funny you mentioned the soundtrack too, like kind of like how we talked about Mortal Kombat last year, how big that particular soundtrack was for that movie.
Right.
Like, it's really rare we hear about movie soundtracks nowadays. We hear about movie scores, but like movie soundtracks is what helps drive movies too. And this soundtrack definitely drove this movie. And like I said, I mean, I work at a bank and we listen to contemporary music all day. You know how many times I hear I Want to Sex You Up like every goddamn day. Right. I'm just saying that's how powerful this soundtrack is, you know?
Right.
And I got a nitpick with the soundtrack though.
Sure.
How on earth you have Flavor Flav in this movie, but no Public Enemy on the soundtrack?
Right.
I'm real bothered by that.
Right. The only thing, you know, and I have no facts, but, you know, if I had to speculate, I would say that probably the subject matter within the film was probably contrary to what Public Enemy was trying to stand for at the time. And so they probably didn't want to have anything to do with it.
Yeah. Okay. So as a generalization, again, I mentioned it earlier, like you get great performances from Ice-T and Wesley Snipes. Mario Van Peebles, I'm not going to knock his performance too much because he's also directing. He's starring and directing. So I'm not going to knock that performance. But the one major nitpick, it's not really a problem with the movie per se. It's more so the editing. And I don't know whose idea was this, but so we go from so going back to where Chris Rock's character dies and he's got a bomb strapped to him.
Right.
And it's a really, really, really great and intense scene. And he's like, on 3, I want you to wiggle the blue wire and pull it out. The bomb scene here, it's intense. And then as soon as this bomb scene's over, the moment is over, it cuts right into a love scene with Wesley Snipes. I'm like, wait a minute. How do we go from this intense bomb scene to a love scene back to back like that? That's all. That's my major nitpick. That's it.
Right.
It was off-putting for me.
And I'm with you in terms of the pacing. It's a little weird, but if I had to defend it, I think what they were going for was that this is Nino Brown's world in terms of the violence and the blood and everything that goes with that. And the fact that you can just cut to a scene where he's, you know, being amorous with somebody, that shows that he's not bothered by it. That's who he is. I think they were trying to show that, but it just didn't. The way those two scenes were paired, I think you're right. It just kind of didn't play as well as they'd hoped.
Okay, I know you got some nitpicks, man. If you want to dish on them.
Well, you know, it's kind of like, you know, some of the other films that we've talked about. You know, certain films from that era, they kind of played well during that time, but as films have evolved and we look back at some of this stuff, some things don't really hold up very well. One of the things that really bothers me is the courtroom scene. I think that the performances are generally great. I like Wesley Snipes' speech in that.
Yes.
I like the performance from Bill Cobb, who winds up shooting him at the end. Spoiler alert. But the actual courtroom procedures didn't seem particularly realistic to me. And it really took me out of it, particularly when he's on the stand after he gives his speech. And then there's like a little, you know, like counselors approaching the bench. And then all of a sudden, like he gets his sentence. They decide to only give him a year despite all the charges stacked up against him. It was too much. Like I just couldn't buy it at all.
Well, remember, he's wealthy and connected. And he was egging on to Ice-T about it. Then the old man comes in and then we see probably one of those greatest deaths, probably since Die Hard.
Right, that fall. That was a Hans Gruber fall for sure.
Yeah, he gets shot and he just looks cool dying, like he falls frontward off the balcony.
But what's even better to me is the reactions. So he gets shot, he looks down, and then he starts to fall, and then you see everybody's face, right? You see like it's just straight close-ups, and most of the people are shocked, but then they show Judd Nelson's face and he's just smiling, and then they show Ice-T and he just puts on his sunglasses and walks out. It was just like, yes, so satisfying.
Yeah, absolutely. And no doubt, we touched on it earlier, we just close it off on this, the influence that this movie still has to this day. It was, like you said, it was basically the first of its kind. And it's funny is that this movie predates Boys in the Hood by like a few months, which also another gangster rapper at the time, Ice Cube, and his breakout performance.
Right.
But New Jack City beat them to the punch. And not only that, we got all these great gangster movies to follow, but I can think of several movies that takes great influence from. For example, Blind Spotting's become one of my favorite gangster films in the past few years. It's on HBO Max, phenomenal movie. But one of my favorite movies of all time, and it's probably Denzel Washington's second best movie, American Gangster. The parallels between American Gangster and New Jack City is absolutely incredible. Like, it's almost like script for script, the same movie, but just executed differently.
Right. And there are a number of films that were like that, just like you mentioned. It was so influential, not just on other films, but just like in pop culture, music in particular. The Cash Money Brothers, or the Hot Boys, they took their name from the gang that was in New Jack City. The Carter, which is an album from Lil Wayne, gets its name from the apartment complex that Nino Brown takes over for his drug enterprise. There are tons of references throughout the years to Nino Brown, to Pookie, to Scotty. It has just sort of permeated pop culture over these past 3 decades. And so that alone makes it, one of the most important films of the 90s.
Absolutely. It's entertaining, it's educational, it's influential, and it's a fun watch. To me, it's probably not the greatest gangster movie by any means, but one of the most influential ones. If I had to give this movie, New Jack City, a rating, solid 7.5 out of 10. As an influential movie, probably higher, but as a movie on its own, I'd give about 7.5 out of 10.
Yeah. This movie, to me, there are certain things in it that don't really hold up, by modern standards. Yeah. But you have to give credit where credit is due. And as far as a first-time outing for Mario Van Peebles, I think that for the time, he absolutely knocked it out of the park. It's an incredible movie. Like I said, one of the first of its kind. And, if I had to give it a modern rating, it would be a 7 out of 10.
So that being said, we ask you to pretty please like, comment, subscribe, ring that bell, spread that shit like so USA, from Louisville to Syracuse, and all of our friends and fans around the world at NerdCage Live. Enjoy life, stay safe, and good night.
Sayonara.
Ooh, trying to get out of the NerdCage, are ya? Well, before you go, hit that subscribe button. And if you're really intrigued, ring that bell. Thank you for dropping by. Until next time, tell everyone you know about NerdCage Live!